The folding chairs came out of the storage closet in stacks of 10, and the sound they made scraping into rows across the polished floor of the Millwood County Veterans Memorial Hall was the sound of every October for as long anyone could remember. A metal-on-wax shriek that set teeth on edge and meant the handler's remembrance ceremony was an hour from starting. Somewhere near the aisle, a dog whined low in her chest, a sound not quite distress and not quite patience, the kind of sound a body makes when it is holding something back. Every year, this same old farmer arrived an hour early, sat in the last row, and left before the reception, and no one had ever asked him why. He was doing exactly that now, easing himself down the center aisle in a fraying brown barn coat, when Staff Sergeant Whitney Pemberton turned from adjusting her dog's harness and put a hand up like a crossing guard. "Sir, this row's reserved for handlers, not spectators." She said it the way she said most things, crisply, with the flat confidence of a woman who had spent 9 years earning the right to be listened to the first time. 29 years old, Force Reconnaissance stock through 2 combat deployments, 9 current clearance certifications stacked behind her name like medals nobody could see, and a service dog at heel who had, until 11 days ago, been the best drilled canine in the county. Against that, a man in a coat gone the color of a dry field, a county fair cap bleached past its original color, and hands that trembled faintly at his sides, the way old hands do at rest, for no reason anyone could name. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at her directly, not right away. He looked at the second row instead, empty of everyone but a stack of folded programs, and something crossed his face that was gone before it had fully arrived. Not hurt, exactly. Recognition of a shape he'd worn 100 times before. If you've ever been overlooked for how you looked instead of what you carried, type steady in the comments. He carried, in fact, very little. A hymnal, cloth-bound, corners gone soft as cloth, a clasp of sun-faded olive drab threaded through his belt loop, folded over on itself, worn shiny on one edge, the way a stair tread wears shiny under 50 years of the same foot. That was all. No cane, no hearing aid to justify the way he sometimes cocked his head before answering, no visible reason at all for a woman with 9 certifications to have looked at him and decided, in under 2 seconds, exactly what he was and was not. "I'll sit further back," he said. 3 words, no heat in them. Didn't mean to be in anybody's way. He turned before she could answer, which left her standing in the aisle with her hand still half raised, feeling, though she could not have said why, as though she'd swung at something that wasn't there. Behind her, the dog's whine climbed half a register and dropped again, and neither of them noticed that its dark eyes had tracked the old man the entire way to the back row, and had not tracked anything else all morning. He sat where he was pointed, which is to say, where nobody would mind, and folded his hands over the hymnal in his lap, and hummed 3 notes under his breath that nobody near him recognized as a hymn at all, only as a low, private sound, the kind a man makes when he is not performing for anyone, only keeping company with something that used to sit beside him. Harlan Sowell was 79 years old, and this was the 58th October since he had last worn a uniform, and not one soul in that hall knew it yet. The tremor lived mostly in his left hand, a fine, persistent shiver that had been with him since somewhere in his 60s, and it did what it always did, which was vanish the instant his hand found a task worth doing, smoothing the hymnal's cover, working a thumb along the leash clasp's worn edge, folding his cap into his coat pocket with the crisp, economical motion of a man who had once folded a great many things under time pressure and never learned to do it any looser. His grip, when he opened the hymnal, closed on the spine with a callus you could trace like a map. 40 years of fence wire and feed sacks laid over 4 years of something else entirely, something the callus did not distinguish and the hand did not explain. He did not go to the guest book by the door, where a ribbon-tied pen waited on a chain and half the county had already signed their names in loops and block print both. He never did. Whoever kept that ledger from year to year would have found, if they'd thought to look, that in 58 Octobers there was no line reading Sowell anywhere in it, not once, and no one had ever thought to look, because no one had ever thought to wonder about the man in the back row long enough to check. The clasp on his belt was not decoration. It had ridden there so long it had become part of the belt's shape, folded twice over and worn glass smooth along its lower curve, where a thumb had worried it thin. The olive drab gone the gray-green of an old fence post, left out through 40 winters. If you had asked him what it was, he would have told you it was nothing, an old dog clip, not worth the asking, and he would have believed it while he said it, the way a man believes the smallest true thing he's willing to hand over. 3 bars, always 3, hummed low enough that the woman 2 seats down never looked up from her program. It was a hymn about a shepherd and a valley, the kind sung slow in small white churches with box fans running in July, and Harlan Sowell had heard it first, from his wife's mouth. 40-some years of Sunday mornings, her voice going a little sharp on the high note, and both of them laughing about it afterward in the truck. Ruth had been gone 6 years now. He still hummed her 3 bars before he let himself sit down anywhere that mattered, a habit so worn into him it no longer registered as remembering. It only registered as beginning. He took the last row the way he took most things now, without complaint, without ceremony, setting the hymnal on his knee and letting his eyes travel the room the way a farmer's eyes travel a field before rain, cataloging what needed doing without appearing to look for anything at all. Folding chairs. A podium draped in bunting gone slightly gray from storage. A framed plaque on an easel near the front, covered still in blue velvet, waiting on its unveiling. A young Marine sergeant running her dog through a heel and sit with the crisp, overcorrected precision of someone who had trained under pressure and never quite unlearned it. He watched all of it the way another man might read a page, slow and thorough, missing nothing, commenting on nothing. And when the dog's eyes found him again across 40 feet of folding chairs and held there a beat too long, Harlan Sowell did not look away, and did not look surprised either. He only closed the hymnal over his thumb to hold his place, the way a man does when he expects to be called back to it. The obedience pass. Sergeant Pemberton ran before the crowd assembled fully, was, by any fair measure, beautiful to watch. Aspen was a black and tan shepherd 4 years into service, and she moved through the sequence, heel, sit, down, stay, recall, with the flat, gleaming precision of an animal built and trained past the point of hesitation, ears up, tail level, eyes tracking Pemberton's hands like a compass tracking north. A scattering of applause went up when the dog held her downstay through the drop of a folding chair somebody knocked over by accident near the coffee table, and Pemberton allowed herself, for just a moment, the small, satisfied stillness of someone who had built something with her hands and watched it hold. She had earned that. Nobody in the hall would have argued otherwise. 9 clearance certifications, 2 deployments, a service dog she had raised from a green pup into the best-drilled canine the county owned, and she ran the pass without a single wasted motion, the kind of competence that does not need an audience, but is, admittedly, sweeter with one. It was into that goodwill that Preston Ogle stepped up to the podium, straightened his tie, and pulled the blue velvet cloth off the recut plaque with the practiced flourish of a man who had rehearsed the gesture in a mirror. 14 months ago, he said, this county corrected an oversight 50 years in the making. The brass caught the overhead light. New lettering, sharp-edged, not yet dulled by handling. Founding handler, Millwood County K-9 Search and Recovery Program. Harold Ogle. My father built this program from nothing. It's long past time this hall said so in brass, instead of just in memory. Applause went up, warm and unquestioning, the kind a room gives a man it likes, and has no reason to doubt. In the back row, Harlan Sowell did not clap. He did not frown either. He looked at the plaque the way he'd looked at the folding chairs, and the dog, and the draped bunting, cataloging, saying nothing, and if anyone had been watching his face instead of the brass, they might have noticed that his jaw had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man deciding, in real time, that a thing is not worth starting today. Corey Millwood noticed. He was 22, an airman on ceremonial detail, handed a water pitcher and a stack of paper cups an hour ago, and told to keep the older veterans hydrated and he had done the job dutifully for the front 3 rows, before something pulled his attention to the back. He couldn't have said what. Only that the old man back there had the particular quality of a man watching a play he already knew the ending to, and that unsettled Corey more than anything Pemberton's dog had done all morning. He carried a cup back there anyway. No pitcher this time, just the cup, and set it on the empty chair beside Harlan without making a thing of it. "Didn't want you sitting back here dry, sir." Harlan looked up, and something in his face loosened, just barely, the way a fence post gives half an inch under weight without falling. "Obliged," he said, and that was all. But Corey lingered a second longer than the job required, watching the old man's eyes go back to the plaque at the front of the room, and back to the dog beside it, and not once, in all that watching, back to the guest book by the door. By the time the reception tables were wheeled out and the coffee urns plugged in, Aspen had stopped eating. It was a small thing at first. She turned her nose from the treat pouch Pemberton offered during the photograph line, which nobody thought much of. Dogs went off their feed for all kinds of reasons on a big day. But she turned from it again 10 minutes later. And again, when a volunteer tried from a paper plate of cut hot dogs meant for exactly this purpose. And by the third refusal, Pemberton's jaw had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the dog and everything to do with the folder in her bag, marked with today's date and a reassignment order she had not told anyone about yet. "Sit," she said, low, and Aspen sat, because Aspen always sat, but her weight rocked forward onto her front paws the second the command released her, eyes cutting toward the back of the hall and away again, ears swiveling at every folding chair's shriek, like each one might be the sound she was listening for. "Down," Pemberton tried, and Aspen went down and stayed exactly 4 seconds before rising to her feet again, unbidden, which had not happened in the 2 years since her formal certification. Aspen. Down. Sharper this time. A volunteer near the coffee urn glanced over. Pemberton's fingers found her own thigh and tapped it twice, a habit she wasn't aware she had, the small percussion of a woman running out of certainties. From the back row, Harlan Soule watched all of it without moving, the way he'd watched the obedience pass and the plaque unveiling, and something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Not tension, nothing so obvious as that, but the settled attention of a man reading weather he recognized. Corey Millwood, refilling cups nearby, drifted close enough to follow his gaze. "She's not usually like this," Corey said, quiet. "Aspen's the steadiest dog in the unit. Sarge always says so." Harlan didn't answer right away. He watched the dog turn a full circle in place, twice, the particular useless circling of an animal, working a problem its training had no answer for, and he watched Pemberton's hand come down on her collar, a beat too fast, correcting a dog that didn't need correcting so much as it needed something nobody in that room had thought to offer. "She's not being difficult," he said finally, and his voice, when it came, was plain and unhurried, the voice of a man stating a fact about the weather rather than delivering an opinion. "She's waiting on somebody." Corey looked at him. Waiting on who? Harlan's eyes went back to the dog and stayed there. "Don't rightly know yet, but it isn't the sergeant, and it isn't the food, and it isn't the noise. A dog that won't eat isn't sick most times. She's listening past all of us for something we can't hear." He said it the way he said everything, 3 sentences and no more, and went quiet again, hands folded over the hymnal, watching Aspen pace the width of her handler's reach with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had spent a great many years learning that the truest thing in a room is often the thing making the least noise about itself. Pemberton, 20 feet away, did not hear any of it. She was too busy failing gently and repeatedly to get her dog to lie back down, and too proud yet to wonder why an old farmer in the last row had already worked out what 11 days of her own careful handling had not. 11 minutes into the memorial address, with Colonel Garland Ashcroft's chair at the front, still conspicuously empty, and Preston Ogle 2 sentences into a paragraph about legacy, Aspen broke. She didn't bolt. That was the strange part, the part that made 3 separate people stop breathing at once. She rose from her assigned downstay with no haste at all, walked the width of the center aisle at an even, deliberate pace, past Pemberton's rising hand and the clipped, urgent, Aspen, heel, past 2 full rows of folding chairs and a dozen turning heads, and came to a stop directly in front of Harlan Sowell. Then she put her head in his lap and went still. Not agitated still. Not the coiled stillness she'd worn all morning. A different stillness entirely. The kind that comes over a body only when it has stopped bracing for something. And Harlan's left hand, the one that trembled at rest, the one that had trembled through the whole ceremony, came down on the crown of her head and did not tremble at all. Nobody in the hall spoke. Pemberton stood frozen mid-stride down the aisle, her mouth open on the second syllable of the dog's name, and did not finish it. It was into that silence that the side door opened, 20 minutes later than the program had promised, and Colonel Garland Ashcroft came through it in his dress uniform, moving with the particular haste of a man who has been delayed by something he considers unforgivable. He crossed toward the front, nodding an apology to Ogle, and it was only as he passed the last row that his stride broke entirely. Cut off mid-step, his eyes locked, not on the dog, not on the old man's face, but on the belt loop at Harlan Sowell's hip. That clasp, his voice came out wrong, thinner than the voice he'd walked in with. "Sir, that's a pre-70 pattern. Government issue. I haven't seen that hardware since." He stopped himself, throat working once, and started again, quieter. "Where did you serve?" The whole front of the room turned to look. Ogle's mouth was still open around whatever word he'd been about to say next. Pemberton stood halfway down the aisle, with her hand still half raised toward a dog that was no longer hers to call. Harlan's hand didn't stop moving over Aspen's head, slow, even strokes, the kind you'd use to calm something that had been frightened a long time and had only just now stopped needing to be. 1963 to 67, he said, plain, unhurried, 3 sentences, same as always, though this time the room had gone quiet enough that even his quietest words carried to the back wall. Dog handler, Graves registration and recon support. He looked up at the colonel for the first time, and something passed between the two men that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with recognition, the specific, total recognition of one man seeing a piece of his own history walk back into a room he thought had closed the door on it. Name's Harlan Sowell. Ashcroft did not sit down. He did not finish crossing to his reserved seat at the front, though half the hall was still watching for him to do exactly that. He stood in the aisle instead, one hand coming up to his own chest, as though checking that something was still there, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked clean, down the middle of a single word. "Sir." A beat. "It's an honor." He did not explain it. Not yet. He only stood there, a full colonel in dress uniform, coming to something very close to attention in the center aisle of a hall he'd walked into 20 minutes late, in front of a dog, with her head buried in the lap of a man nobody in that room had thought worth a folding chair up front an hour before. Preston Ogle found his voice first, though it came out smaller than he intended, aimed at Ashcroft rather than at Harlan. "Colonel, we're right in the middle of the program. Whatever this is, we can certainly address it after the closing remarks." Nobody answered him. Aspen had not moved. Harlan Sowell's hand had not stopped its slow, patient motion across her head, and the folded olive-drab clasp on his belt caught the overhead light, the same dull, worn way it had caught it every October for 58 years, waiting, like everything else about him, for someone to finally think to ask. Preston Ogle recovered his composure faster than his voice had suggested he could, smoothing his tie with both hands the way men do when they need their hands to be doing something. "Colonel, with respect, we have a grant renewal due to the county board at noon. The plaque's history was certified by this committee 14 months ago. I don't think today's the day to go relitigating it in front of 200 guests." "Nobody's relitigating anything," Ashcroft said, though he had not moved from the aisle, and his eyes had not moved from Harlan Sowell's belt. "I asked a question. The man answered it." "With a name and 4 years and no paperwork," Ogle said, and there was an edge under the smoothness now, thin but real. "I mean no disrespect to whatever service this gentleman gave, but this hall has a certified history, and that history has my father's name on new brass we paid for out of a heritage grant that requires us to certify accuracy going forward. If we start unraveling that today, in front of the board's own liaison, we lose the grant, and we lose the renewal, and this program doesn't get a fourth year. It gets shut down. That landed harder in the room than the colonel's cracked voice had. A murmur went through the folding chairs. Somewhere near the coffee urns, a volunteer set down a tray too hard. Pemberton, still frozen at the mouth of the aisle, found her own voice then, and it came out sharper than she meant, aimed sideways at anyone who'd listen. And in case it slipped everyone's mind, Aspen's reassignment order is also due at noon. If she doesn't stabilize and pass a fitness reeval by end of day, she gets pulled from active handling and reassigned out of county. I have 11 days of refused food and broken commands to explain to a review board, and right now, the only thing that's calmed her down in that whole span is... She gestured, helpless, at the old man in the back row, unable to finish the sentence in a way that didn't sound absurd out loud. "So maybe," Ogle said, seizing the opening, "the kindest thing, for everyone's sake, is to let this gentleman rest a moment outside, let the sergeant get her dog back under control, and let us finish the ceremony on schedule. We can sort out whatever's between you and the colonel afterward, quietly, the way these things ought to be sorted." It was said gently enough that half the room nodded along before they'd thought it through. The reasonable suggestion, the schedule protected, the old man moved out of the way so the paperwork could keep its noon appointment. A volunteer actually took half a step toward the back row, hand half extended, the way you'd approach someone you meant to help toward an exit. Aspen's head came up off Harlan's lap for the first time since she'd laid it there, and she did not growl, exactly. She made a sound low in her chest, not aggression, something closer to alarm, and pressed herself half a step closer against Harlan's knee instead of away from it. "She'll go back to how she was," Harlan said, and it wasn't a threat. It came out as plain as everything else he'd said all morning, a man reporting weather. "You move me now, she'll be right back where she was 11 days ago, and you'll have a lot less than an hour before that board wants its paperwork signed." Ashcroft, still standing in the aisle, looked at Ogle for a long moment, and something in his face had hardened past politeness. "Preston, sit down a minute. There is a piece of this hall's history that isn't finished being told, and I intend to hear the rest of it before anybody signs anything." He turned to Harlan, and his voice gentled again, though it did not lose its new weight. "Sir, I think you'd better tell us what you know about that plaque." The whole room had gone still enough to hear the coffee urns ticking as they cooled, and into that stillness, Harlan Sowell reached for the hymnal in his lap, worked his thumb beneath the cracked cloth cover, and drew out a single folded sheet of onion skin paper, carbon thin, gone the soft yellow-brown of something kept dry and out of light for a very long time. 14 months back, he said, unfolding it with care, the tremor gone entirely from his hands now that they had a task. Somebody told this committee the original roster burned up in a records fire. That's true enough. The county copy did. He held the paper out, not toward Ogle, but toward Ashcroft, who took it the way a man takes something he already half expects to break his heart. This one didn't. I kept my own carbon. Man learns to, in that line of work, when he doesn't trust an office to hang on to a thing longer than he will himself. Ashcroft's eyes moved down the page, and the room watched his jaw work once, before he read it aloud, because reading it aloud was, in that moment, the only decent thing to do with it. Millwood County K-9 Search and Recovery Program. Founding roster, 1967. A pause. Handler of record, H. Sowell. He looked up. There's no Ogle on this page. Not senior, not otherwise. Just training notes in the margins, in the same hand as the signature. Preston Ogle's face had gone the color of the plaque's velvet drape before it was pulled. That could be anyone's carbon. Anyone could have typed a name on a page 50 years after the fact. "The paper's not the whole of it, Preston," Ashcroft said, quiet now, and something in his voice made the whole room lean in without meaning to. "I know this because I owe this man something no roster's ever going to list." He turned fully to Harlan, and the years seemed to fall off his rank for a moment, leaving something much younger and much more frightened underneath. 1971. I was 19. Culvert flooded out past the old mill road during a training exercise, and I went under it, looking for a downed radio, and didn't come back up on my own steam. There was a dog pulled me out by the collar of my field jacket and held me against the current till a grown man could get down there and finish the job. I was told, later, it was a stray, trained rough, nobody's animal. I believed that for 50-some years. His eyes went to the clasp on Harlan's belt and stayed there. That's not a stray's leash clasp. That's handler issue. That dog was yours. You trained her off the books after your own discharge, and you never told a soul. And you sure as hell never let anybody log the rescue, because I went looking for the paperwork once, years back, out of gratitude, and there wasn't any to find. Harlan's hand had gone still on the hymnal's cover. When he spoke, it was the plainest thing he'd said all day. Didn't need the paper to know it happened. Figured you didn't either. The hall had gone so quiet that Aspen's low, steady breathing against Harlan's knee was the loudest sound in the room. Colonel Ashcroft did not sit down. He stood in the center aisle with the carbon roster still open in his hands, and for a long moment nobody in that hall moved, as though moving might break whatever had just settled over the room, like dust, after a long silence finally allowed to fall. 58 years, he said finally. Half to Harlan and half to the room at large. You've had a document in your possession, 58 years, that would have put your name on that brass the day it was cut, and you let another man's name go up instead. Why? Harlan looked down at Aspen, who had not lifted her head from his lap since the moment she'd laid it there, and his hand resumed its slow motion over her, the tremor gone the way it always went when there was work worth doing. Wasn't mine to claim in a room full of strangers, he said. Never was about that. He was quiet a moment, and when he went on, his voice had softened into something closer to memory than testimony. My wife used to come to these. Every October, same seat, second row on the aisle, so I could get up easy if one of the dogs got restless during the program. Some of them did, back when I still helped train the young handlers on the side. She'd save that spot without me even asking. Wasn't till she passed that I started coming in and taking whatever chair was open, and I noticed nobody minded much if that chair was in the back. He paused, and something moved behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the crowd around him. She used to save the aisle seat for me. I got used to sitting where nobody'd mind. Didn't need the front row. Didn't need my name on anything. She was the only one who ever needed to know who I was, and she knew it plain enough without a plaque telling her. Nobody in the hall spoke. Sergeant Pemberton had come to a stop 3 feet away, her hand no longer reaching for her dog, no longer reaching for anything, and there were tears standing in her eyes that she made no attempt to blink away. Harlan reached into his coat pocket, unhurried, and drew out a strip of dried venison wrapped in a paper napkin, the kind a man keeps on him out of long habit rather than any plan, and unwrapped it slow, letting Aspen watch every motion of his hands the way you'd let a nervous animal see a gate before you opened it. He held it out flat on his open palm, not pushed toward her, simply offered and waited. It took her 11 seconds, long enough that Pemberton's breath caught twice waiting on it. Then Aspen's head came up off his knee, and she took the meat from his palm as gently as a dog can take anything, and ate it there in front of 200 witnesses who had watched her refuse every plate and pouch offered in 11 days, and the sound that came out of Whitney Pemberton was not a word at all, just breath, released all at once, both hands coming up to cover her mouth. Preston Ogle stood very still at the podium for a long moment, the velvet drape still crumpled in one hand where he'd pulled it off the plaque an hour before. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the polish it carried during the unveiling. My father told me he built this program, he said, quiet, mostly to himself. I believed him because he was my father, and because believing him got me a grant, and got him a plaque, and got me, if I'm honest, a way to feel like I'd done something too, just by asking for it to be true. He looked at Harlan, and something in his face had gone loose with something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite relief either. I'll have the plaque recut. Today, if the foundry can rush it. Your name, Mr. Sowell. Not mine. Not his. I'll withdraw my father's award application from the county docket myself this afternoon. He swallowed. I'm sorry. That's not enough. I know it isn't. But I don't know what else there is to say to a man I stood in front of and never once thought to ask his name. Harlan looked at him a long moment, and there was no triumph in his face, only the same settled patience he'd carried since he first sat down in the back row that morning. "Their names should be on that brass," he said. "Every handler who trained a dog for this county deserves that much, your father included, if he served this program honest in whatever way he did. I'm not looking to erase a man, only to put the truth back where it belongs." He looked down at Aspen, who had settled fully now, weight sunk against his leg, eyes half closed. "Fix the plaque if you want to fix something. That's worth more to me than my own name ever was." Sergeant Pemberton knelt slowly in the aisle beside her dog, one hand coming to rest, careful and disbelieving, on Aspen's flank, and looked up at Harlan with the particular humility of a woman who had run a flawless obedience pass that morning and understood, only now, everything her training had never taught her to see. "Sir," she said, and her voice had lost every trace of the crispness it carried at the start of the day. "Will you show me how you did that?" Harlan's hand did not stop its slow motion over the dog's back. "Wasn't a trick," he said. "Just waited long enough to be trusted. She'll teach you the rest, if you let her." 8 months later, the folding chairs came out again for another October, and this time, the sound they made scraping across the floor of the Millwood County Veterans Memorial Hall found Harlan Sowell already seated in the front row, second seat from the aisle, the same seat Ruth had always saved without being asked. The plaque above the podium caught the morning light, the way new brass does, though it had been 8 months since the foundry rushed the recasting, long enough now that a few fingerprints had already dulled its shine in the places people touched it walking past. Founding Handler, Millwood County K-9 Search and Recovery Program, Harlan Sowell. Below it, in smaller letters, Preston Ogle had insisted on adding himself, a second line, "With gratitude to every handler, named and unnamed, who trained a dog for this county and asked for nothing in return." Aspen lay at Harlan's feet, off duty today, her formation harness swapped for a plain collar, and looped through the collar's ring, small and worn smooth on one edge, hung the sun-faded olive-drab clasp that had ridden his belt loop 58 years. He'd given it to her that spring, once Pemberton's fitness reevalu came back clean, and the reassignment order got quietly shredded, and he had told nobody why, except that it had done its work on him a long time, and seemed due for a change of duty. Ruth's hymnal sat open on his knee, not folded shut the way he used to carry it, but open to the page she'd hummed every Sunday of their marriage, the corner worn soft as cloth, from 40 years of the same thumb turning to it. He hummed the 3 bars low under his breath before the program began, same as always, and this time, Corey Millwood, 2 seats down in a fresh set of stripes, leaned over and hummed the 4th bar back to him, quiet, having asked once, months ago, what the tune was, and been told. Whitney Pemberton stood at the podium this year instead of running an obedience pass for applause, and when she spoke of the program's true history, her voice did not crack the way Ashcroft's had, but it came close, and she did not once look down at notes. The hall went quiet when she finished, but it was a different quiet than the one that had followed Harlan into the back row a year before. Not the silence of not knowing what a man was worth, but the settled, unhurried silence of a room that finally did. Some debts take 58 years to come due, and they always find the seat in the back row first, waiting there patiently, the way a hymn waits inside a hymnal for someone to open it to the right page, the way a leash clasp waits on a belt loop for the day it finally gets handed on to somebody else's collar. And Harlan Sowell sat in the front row with his wife's book open on his knee and his hand resting, still, on the head of a dog who had chosen him before anyone else in that hall had thought to.